At some point, every NBA team sucked. Some franchises had their worst seasons due to injuries, for some it was bad trades. But most teams' ultimate downfall was inexperience mixed with a lack of talent. For two franchises, their worst campaign ever happened in the 23-24 season. So here are the worst seasons for every NBA franchise. Starting with the worst NBA team of all time, the 2012 Charlotte Bobcats. The 2012 season started after a lockout and was shortened to 66 games. But for Charlotte, it would be better if the season didn't start at all, because all year long, they were a punching bag for the rest of the NBA. Playing with a bunch of inexperienced players, with almost zero shooting and rebounding, the Bobcats emerged victorious in just 7 out of 66 games, and their 10.6% win percentage is the worst in NBA history. The 2012 Bobcats had the worst offense and the worst defense in the league, and their minus 15.2 net rating tied the worst of all time. However, just 4 years later, one team tried their best to beat that mark because they were literally trying to lose games on purpose. It was the Philadelphia 76ers, whose GM Sam Hinkie wanted to deliberately lose for several years to get high draft picks and become a contender in the future. Hinkie tried to justify those painful years with the mantra, "Trust the process."
It's not about how it turns out. It's about what you knew at the time and how that plays out for your particular team and for their particular team.
Which, in all honesty, it kind of worked. After they finished the 2016 season with the league worst 10-72 record, including 26 consecutive losses, they got the #1 pick in the draft. But even with all that, despite the most hardcore tanking in NBA history, the process wasn't the most dreadful iteration of the 76ers. Because in 1973, the Sixers had an even worse season, with just 9 wins and 73 losses. After they won 30 games the previous season, a couple of key players left the team. Add that with a few injuries and some bad luck in close games, and you get a Sixers team that opened the season with 15 straight losses. It was soon followed by another streak of 20 consecutive losses. And until the Bobcats broke their record, the 73 Sixers with an 11% win percentage had the worst regular season of all time. And if there was an award for the worst decade in professional sports, that award would probably go to the 90s Dallas Mavericks. After they made the 1990 NBA playoffs, the Mavs went through a 10-year postseason drought. And during that period, they averaged just 24 wins per season, including the 2 worst seasons in franchise history. In 1993, the Mavericks had one of the least experienced teams ever, as 13 of their 18 players were either rookies or sophomores. With the season-ending injury to Fat Lever, Derek Harper was the only guy on the roster who wasn't playing on a rookie contract. And with that kind of inexperience, it wasn't strange that they went through the longest ass-whooping of their lives. The 93 Mavs won just 11 games, with the worst offensive and defensive rating in the NBA, and set the NBA record for the worst net rating of all time, which would later be tied by the 2012 Bobcats. The Mavericks also have the record for the worst point differential of all time, finishing the 93 season with a differential of negative 1,246 points. And the next season, the situation barely improved, as the Mavs won just 13 games, which set the record for the worst 2-year stretch in NBA history. But 5 years later came a team that came very close to beating that record. It all started in 1996, when the Denver Nuggets made a series of bad decisions. First, they let Dikembe Mutombo walk away for free, declining his wish to sign a 10-year contract. Then they traded Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf and Jalen Rose, and all they had left was unproven young players and aging vets. After losing their most talented players, Denver won just 21 games in 1997. And you'd think they'd learn that trading away good players isn't a recipe for success, but they didn't. Also trading away Antonio McDyess, the 2nd overall pick from the 96 draft and their best defender, and it went from bad to worse. Eric Williams, the guy that came in for McDyess, played just 4 games before he injured his knee, and the Nuggets started the 1998 season 2-38, which included a then record of 23 consecutive losses. For the entire season, Denver won just 11 games, with the worst offense and defense in the league, and the 2nd worst net rating ever, trailing only the 93 Mavs. In the next season, they won 14 games in a locked-out shortened season, and they remained horrible until they drafted Carmelo Carmelo Anthony in 2003. Still, while some teams sucked for a decade, there was one franchise that was an NBA laughingstock for half a century. Before the Lob City era and Steve Ballmer's purchase of the team, the Clippers were the most unsuccessful franchise in the NBA, and by a wide margin. Between 1971 and 2011, the Clippers made the playoffs just 7 times, winning only 2 playoff series in 40 years. There were plenty of horrible Clippers teams during that stretch, but the award for the worst one goes to the 1987 team, albeit mostly due to injuries. Cedric Maxwell, a former Finals MVP, missed 47 games, and Marquez Johnson, a 5-time All-Star, and the actor playing the role of Raymond in White Men Can't Jump, played in only 10 games before rupturing a disc in his neck that would essentially end his career. The Clippers didn't make the playoffs the previous year with Johnson and Maxwell at full strength, and without their 2 best players, they were doomed. The Clips lost 70 games that season, breaking the NBA record for the worst defensive rating ever at the time. And if there's any team who knows the Clippers' pain of living in the shadow of one of the most popular franchises on the planet, it's the Nets. New York's other team was always treated with a dose of condescension by the Knicks fans, even though the Nets were often more successful, especially when they played in New Jersey during the early 2000s. And 2 years before they relocated to Brooklyn in 2012, the Nets suffered the worst season in franchise history, going 12-70 in the 2010 season. Apart from Brook Lopez, who was in his second season, it was a team full of bench players who suddenly got a chance to play due to the lack of talent on the Nets. They started the season with 18 straight losses and had just 3 wins in the first 43 games, firing 2 coaches in the process. But nobody could help them as they were simply too depleted of talent. And when you're under-talented but also very disorganized, then you have a recipe for disaster. In 2005, the Atlanta Hawks went through one of the biggest personnel turnovers in franchise history, bringing in 8 new players and getting rid of nearly all the starters from the previous season. Nobody expected this team to be good, but when their best player, Antoine Walker, got traded mid-season, paired with a couple of injuries to Tyronn Lue and Tony Delk, the Hawks started losing in bunches. Atlanta won just 3 of their final 35 games, finishing with a 13-69 record and the worst net rating in the NBA. But next, we have a franchise that was so bad, they had to change countries. We're talking about the Grizzlies, who were founded in Vancouver in 1995, where they completely stunk up the place. In the 6 seasons the Grizzlies spent north of the border, they never even managed to eclipse 23 wins. The Grizzlies drafted poorly, and because free agents probably considered retirement before moving to Vancouver to play basketball, they had no hope of improvement, averaging just 17 wins per year during their time in Canada. And the worst of those 6 seasons was in the lockout-shortened 1999, when the Grizzlies went 8-42, led by Sharif Abdul-Rahim and rookie Mike Bibby, who were the only players on that team even worth mentioning. Of course, the legendary big country Bryant Reeves was also there, but he started having injury problems and missed half the season, retiring after the Grizzlies' last season in Canada. And the most recent team on this list was setting negative records in 2024, when they broke the most infamous record for most consecutive losses in a season. Of course, we're talking about the Detroit Pistons.
Detroit Pistons are a horror show.
Who lost 28 in a row and tied the process 76ers for most consecutive losses overall. After 43 games, the Pistons had just 4 wins and were on the pace of becoming the worst team of all time, despite paying their coach $13 million per season. However, Detroit managed to suck a little bit less towards the end of the year, finishing the 2024 season with 14 wins and 68 losses, avoiding more negative records. Tied with the Pistons and sharing a terrible 14-68 record, we have another historic franchise, the Houston Rockets. But unlike Detroit, the Rockets' worst season happened over 40 years ago, and just 2 seasons after they made the NBA Finals. In 1981, led by Moses Malone, the Rockets stunned the NBA by making the NBA Finals as a 6th seed, where they would ultimately lose 4-2 to the Boston Celtics. But just 2 years later, due to a poor financial situation, the Rockets were forced to let Moses Malone go, despite him winning the '82 MVP and being arguably the best player in the NBA. And without Big Moses, the Rockets collapsed like a sandcastle in the rain. In 1983, their leading scorer averaged just 14.8 points per game, and their net rating of -11.2 was the second worst ever at the time. But after winning just 14 games in 1983, the Rockets secured the #1 overall pick, which they used on Ralph Sampson. And in 1984, they got another first pick, drafting Hakeem Olajuwon.
The Houston Rockets select Hakeem Olajuwon, a of the University of Houston.
In just 3 years after their worst season ever, they were in the NBA Finals again, providing their fans with an unbelievable emotional roller coaster in a span of 5 years. And if you remember the Golden State Warriors' worst season ever, congratulations for living a very long life. And for everyone else, the worst season for the Warriors happened while they were still in Philadelphia, in the early days of basketball, dating all the way back to 1953, which was only the 4th season that the league was called the NBA. There were only 10 teams back then, and 8 of them made the playoffs, but the Warriors weren't among them because they had a horrible 12-57 record. As a team, they shot just 36% from the field and 68% from the free throw line. But you can probably still find some old-timers out there who would say that was real basketball. And those guys would beat Steph Curry and the current Warriors players. And the next team is the most decorated franchise in the NBA, with 18 championship banners and very few losing seasons. But the Celtics had a dry spell between Larry Bird's retirement and the arrival of the truth. Between their inaugural season in 1947 and 1993, the C's missed the playoffs a total of 7 times in 46 years. And then they missed it 6 times in a row between 1996 and 2001, including a horrendous 1997 season, when they won just 15 games and lost 67. The 97 Celtics didn't have a lot of talent to begin with, but when their 2 best players, Dino Radja and Dana Barros, got hurt and missed the majority of the season, it got ugly quickly. And that's how the Celtics ended up with their worst season in franchise history. And a similar fate struck another perennial winner of the Larry O'Brien Trophy, who suffered their worst season just 3 years after winning an NBA title. But unlike the Celtics, the Bulls haven't recovered since. And it doesn't look like they will if we look at the current roster. Still, however bad the Bulls may look now, they will hardly be worse than the 2001 team. After 1998 and The Last Dance, all of the Bulls' championship players either retired or left the team within 2 years. And when the 2001 season rolled around, Chicago's basketball team looked unrecognizable. Even though they had Ron Artest, Jamal Crawford, Brad Miller, and Elton Brand, who all had great NBA careers, they were all young back then, with no experience. And the Bulls, as a whole, were awful, with the worst net rating in franchise history and a 15-67 record. And this next team used to be famous for losing to the Bulls and Michael Jordan. Before they drafted LeBron, losing to Jordan in the 1992 Conference Finals was as far as the Cleveland Cavaliers could go, and they had the reputation as one of the least successful NBA franchises, winning just 4 playoff series in their first 35 years of existence. Furthermore, the Cavs are one of 4 teams on this list to match their worst record in a season more than once. Cleveland had 2 seasons with a 15-67 record, once in their inaugural NBA season in 1971 and then again in 1982, in a season where they played 23 different players and exchanged 4 head coaches, only to end up losing more games. And just like the Cavs, the Miami Heat also had 2 horrible seasons, with the same 15-67 record. And just like the Cavs, the first of those seasons happened in Miami's inaugural year in the NBA, which was to be expected for an expansion team that formed its roster from players that the other teams didn't want. But the second time the Heat had a 15-67 season, it was just 2 years after they won the NBA title. In 2008, Shaq's production was falling off a cliff, and he was feuding with coach Pat Riley, nearly getting into a fistfight with him, after which O'Neal was traded to Phoenix. And with injuries to both Dwayne Wade and Udonis Haslem, and the advanced age of Alonzo Mourning and Jason Williams, it wasn't a surprise that this Heat season went down the drain. And 1 year after Miami, the Minnesota Timberwolves came to the NBA, in an expansion that also saw the birth of the Orlando Magic. And like all the expansion franchises, the Timberwolves weren't any good, winning an average of 21 games in their first 6 years, until they drafted Kevin Garnett and finally started seeing some W's in the win-loss column. The worst of those early years, though, was the 1992 season, when the Wolves posted a 15-67 record, a feat they would match in 2010, with the likes of Darko Milicic, Sasha Pavlovich, and Ryan Gomes playing significant minutes. And this next team had a league MVP and one of the best European players ever on their roster. They just didn't know it yet. With a 15-67 record in the 2013-2014 season, we have the Milwaukee Bucks, when Giannis was just a skinny rookie, and Chris Middleton was a second-year guy who had just started showing flashes of potential. The first option on the team was Brandon Knight, a guy who is most famous for getting his ankles broken by Kyrie and dunked on by DeAndre Jordan. so it's no wonder this team wasn't that great. And the final franchise with a 15-67 record as their worst season is a team from last year. And that's the 2024 Washington Wizards. When your best players are Jordan Poole, who appeared on Shaqtin' a Fool more than any other player last year,
David people, random guy, Terrell Owens, Ocho Cinco,
and Kyle Kuzma, who looked more concerned with fashion than winning games, then it's no wonder that you won just 15 times in a season. But unlike the Wizards, the Phoenix Suns posted their worst result in their first season in the NBA. The Suns came to the league in 1968, finishing with 16 wins and 66 losses as newcomers. That Phoenix team wasn't that bad offensively, and they even had two All-Stars in Gail Goodrich and Dick Van Arsdale. But the first-year Suns were a black hole on defense, giving up 120 points per game, which was the main cause of their bad record. And moving from sunny Arizona to icy Canada, we have the Raptors, who came to the NBA in 1995 and had their worst season ever in 1998, even though they had multiple Hall of Famers on their roster. The 98 Raptors started the year 1-19, after which they traded the biggest star on the team, Damon Stoudemire. The guy they traded for, Kenny Anderson, refused to play for the team because he believed the Raptors were trash. So Toronto was forced to make another trade, acquiring future Hall of Famer Chauncey Billups and pairing him with Tracy McGrady. But both T-Mac and Chauncey were just rookies, and they couldn't help Toronto win games, as the Raptors finished the season with a 16-66 record, which was bad. But it also gave them the opportunity to draft the most important player in franchise history. Vince Carter was supposed to be the next Michael Jordan, but the only true heir to MJ's throne proved to be that little Laker boy who wanted to take everybody one-on-one.
I don't Laker boys want to take everybody one-on-one.
Thank you, you're gonna make it.
I'm gonna make this a one-on-one game.
And this may be hard to believe, but the worst season in Lakers history happened with Kobe on the team, albeit it was also the worst season of Kobe's career. It was the 2015-2016 season, when the Lakers were less concerned about winning games and more focused on the enormous media attention of Kobe's retirement tour. The Lakers won just 17 games that season, but outside of Lakers fans, nobody really cared, especially after Bryant scored 60 in the last game of the season, dropping the mic on a legendary career.
Mamba out.
And 1 year earlier, another historic franchise had their worst season ever. But unlike the Lakers, the New York Knicks sucked for most of the 21st century, making the playoffs just 2 times from 2000 until 2010. But then they added Carmelo Anthony and Amare Stoudemire, who were supposed to take their franchise to the promised land and deliver the title they'd been missing since the 70s. But all they got was one playoff series win in 2013, followed by a 37-win season where they missed the playoffs. And then in 2015, the worst season in franchise history, with just 17 wins and a bitter taste in everyone's mouth.
The New York Knicks looked like straight trash.
Amare's knees were giving out, Carmelo missed half the season, and the rest of the roster was discombobulated, with no continuity and sense whatsoever. And then, in 2019, it happened again, and the Knicks had another 17-65 season due to a complete lack of talent, with their roster including the likes of Kevin Knox, Emmanuel Mudiay, Dennis Smith Jr., and Mario Hezonja, all draft busts currently out of the NBA. Another team with an all-time worst record of 17-65 is a franchise that moved a lot. From winning the 1951 NBA title as the Rochester Royals to the days of the Cincinnati Royals with Oscar Robertson, and then after short stints in Nebraska and Kansas City, the Kings finally settled in Sacramento in 1985. And despite all the moving and the tumultuous past, the worst era for the Kings happened between 2006 and 2022, when they missed the playoffs for 16 consecutive years, which is an NBA record. The most horrible among those bad years was 2009, when Kenyon Martin was the only bright spot on the team that won just 17 games and ranked near the bottom of nearly all statistical categories. And while the Kings' playoff drought was bad, only one NBA team has never even made the conference finals before, and that's the New Orleans Pelicans. After joining the league in 2002 and originally being known as the Hornets, New Orleans spent their first 2 seasons in the Eastern Conference, making the playoffs on both occasions. But in their third year, when they moved to the Western Conference, they suffered the worst worst season in franchise history, winning just 18 games in the 2005 season. The team started the campaign 2-29, and after the trade of Baron Davis and David Wesley, it was clear that the team was waving the white flag, and that their only hopes were to get a high draft pick. But unlike New Orleans, the next franchise started their worst season with promising results. The year was 1989, and the Orlando Magic had just joined the NBA, starting their first season with 7 wins and 7 losses. However, there was a landslide from there. Even though the team had the 5th best point total in the league, their defense was dead last, conceding 120 points per game. The Magic finished the season with an 18-64 record, and to their credit, it was the only season in franchise history where they failed to win at least 20 games in a season. And similar to Orlando and many other teams, the Portland Trail Blazers had their worst season at the beginning of their NBA road, in their second season. It was 1972, and the Trail Blazers clearly had some growing pains trying to establish an NBA franchise. Coach Roland Todd was fired late in the season and replaced by Stu Inman, while players battled with management over that decision and kept piling on losses, finishing with an 18-64 record. It was a tumultuous first few seasons, to say the least, and it took Portland 7 years to make the playoffs. But when they did, they immediately won the NBA championship, led by Bill Walton. And next, we have the team with the best all-time record, winning close to 60% of their regular season games. It's the San Antonio Spurs, who haven't had many losing seasons. From 1976 until now, the Spurs have had a losing record just 11 times, and only in 4 seasons did they win less than 30 games. Their worst record happened in 1997, when an injury to David Robinson and tanking for Tim Duncan contributed to only 20 wins. But it was worth it. They got the first overall pick and the right to select Timmy, the greatest player in franchise history and one of the 10 greatest players of all time. And this next franchise was founded the same year as the Spurs, the OKC Thunder, an artist formerly known as the Supersonics, playing in Seattle for 40 years before relocating to Oklahoma in 2008. The franchise made 4 NBA Finals and won 1 championship, and were generally more successful than not, without many catastrophic seasons. Their worst year came in 2008, their last season in Seattle, when the Supersonics finished with a 20-62 record, led by a rookie Kevin Durant. And just like the Supersonics, the Indiana Pacers were also founded in 1967, but they first joined the ABA, becoming a member of the NBA after the merger of the 2 leagues in 1976. After they won 3 ABA titles, the Pacers weren't as successful in the NBA, and during their first 13 seasons, they made the playoffs just 2 times. The least successful of those early seasons was in 1983, when they had the youngest team in the NBA, finishing with a 20-62 record. And finally, we have the Utah Jazz, whose worst season is the least bad out of all NBA franchises. Founded in New Orleans in 1974, in their first 50 years as an NBA franchise, the Jazz have only had 7 seasons with less than 30 wins, and their worst season occurred in their first year in the NBA. Even though they had the legendary Pete Maravich, the Jazz couldn't escape the purgatory of an expansion team, winning just 23 games in the regular season. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, we have another one for you right here.